right, slide 4. We're going to talk a little bit more about Persian kings, and we skip a couple after Darius, and we get to Xerxes, which I always thought was an interesting name. Xerxes the First is probably who we think was the king in the book of Esther. So he reigned from 486 to 484 BC. That date doesn't quite sound right. I think it was actually 464. But anyway, I think I typed it wrong on here. 486 to 464 BC. Anyway, the book of Esther, which is one of his wives who really saved the Jews from destruction under Xerxes. We believe it is written about Xerxes. The Bible uses the word Ahasuerus, not Xerxes, but we believe that it's the same person. And you see these kings aren't really worshiping God, and there's a lot of political things going on, especially with different kings. But what we see is a common thread, that these kings are generally good to the Jews, and they give them a lot of freedom in Jerusalem to do what they need to do. And Xerxes really wasn't much different. He if it is the king in Esther, he loved Esther and he listened to her. And Esther really is a great story about saving the Jews from destruction from some of the king's, some of his advisors who hated the Jews and tried to destroy them. What history tells us of Xerxes is that there were lots of wars with Greece during his reign. In the year 481, Xerxes defeated Sparta, and the Spartan king Leonidas at the Battle of Thermopylae. I am not recommending you watch the movie 300. It's probably an old movie to you guys. It's pretty rough. I wouldn't recommend you watching it. But if you have seen it or heard of it, it is about this battle where the Spartan king Leonidas is defeated, but it really, with a small group of men, defeated by Xerxes, but they really started to turn the tide of Persia defeating Greece. And a year later, Xerxes loses to the Greek fleet at a naval battle called Salamis. For those of you who don't know what a naval battle is, that means it was fought on the water out of boats. And I have no idea what that would have been like. It sounds like quite a scary thing for whoever was involved. But the Greek fleet beat the fleet of Persia, and that was a huge turning point for relations between Greece and Persia. The next king was Artaxerxes the First, 464 to 423 BC, and during his reign there were two groups of exiles, Jewish exiles, that were allowed to return back to Jerusalem. The first one in his reign, which technically was the second group of exiles that returned. Again, the first one was under Cyrus. But the second group was in 458, and that included Ezra, who obviously wrote the book of Ezra. So they went back to try to improve worship, the worship of God in Jerusalem. They had a temple, but they still had a problem. There were no walls in Jerusalem. And that's where Nehemiah comes in. So Ezra came back to try to get the Israelites, the Jews, in more of a close relationship with God, and really tried to improve worship. And he really helped them with that. But it was still very difficult because of the lack of walls, and the walls are what protected the city. So even though they were able to build the temple, they were still being hassled a lot, and that's probably saying it lightly, by several of the neighboring countries. And it was difficult for the Persians to really monitor that, or probably to even care. But we're going to pick up with that in the book of Nehemiah. So Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 15. Ultimately, Nehemiah was the cupbearer of the king, and we believe this was Artaxerxes. And Nehemiah asked to go back to help build the walls, and the king allowed it. So Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 15 and 16. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of Elul in 52 days. And it happened when all our enemies heard of it, and all the nations around us saw these things, that they were very disheartened in their own eyes, for they perceived that this work was done by our God. So Nehemiah is a great story about that. I'm not giving justice to how difficult it was to build this wall. And what this artist's picture that's on the slide here shows is that they were under such attack that the men had to be armed while they were building the wall. They set guards every so many feet, and the men who were working had to have swords on them because they were constantly being attacked by people that didn't want them to build the wall because they wanted to be able to control them. And it was finished after he started in 52 days. Nehemiah was a great leader, and he, through God's work, he and the people built this wall and finally secured the city of Jerusalem. So this was another turning point in history for securing Jerusalem from a lot of the neighbors around Jerusalem that wanted to control it. We're picking up with slide number 5. We're getting close to being done with this one. But we're going to switch gears, moving from Persia to Greece. So if you looked at the previous slide, you see Nehemiah was in around the year 444. And Nehemiah is about the end of the historical books in the Old Testament. And basically once they get Jerusalem kind of under control, that's it. From a time standpoint, that's kind of where the Old Testament ends. And there is a gap of a good 300 years between that stage in history and when the New Testament picks up with the birth of Jesus, or over 300 years basically. But we're going to talk about what happens during this time frame because there are some significant historical things that happen in the world and as well as in the Promised Land around Jerusalem. And we want to talk starting off with Greece. So remember, we talked earlier that Greece and Persia had really been fighting for quite some time. In the time of Xerxes, Greece started to have a turning point, and they started to win some battles. But it wasn't until Alexander the Great that Greece successfully invaded Asia. So we're going to talk real quick about the time, and then I've got something to read to you that I think is really interesting. So in the year 336, history tells us that Alexander the Great's father dies, and he becomes king at the young age of 20. And very soon after that, he starts his journey eastward to conquer the known world. So Greece was already a big deal in Europe, obviously, but the Greeks had never successfully defeated Persia and crossed into Asia, what we think of as Turkey. But Alexander the Great did that in 334. And in 334, the Macedonian, that's another word for the Greek army, crosses into Turkey and wins the Battle of Granaeus River. The next year at 333, Alexander defeats Darius III, who was the current king of Persia, at the Battle of Issus. And this was huge. This was although they hadn't invaded all of Persia, this was a total defeat of the Persian army. And Persia would never be the same after this year, 333. The picture in this, on this slide, is a mosaic that was recovered from Pompeii. And it is of Alexander, who's riding a horse on the left side, and Darius III, who I think is the one in the chariot, kind of on the right side. What is really amazing, I'm not trying to get into an art lesson here, but is to think about what a mosaic is. This is not a drawing or a painting. This was done with really small pieces of tile. And this was actually secured from the ruins in Pompeii. And it's just amazing that someone had the ability to do this. But it shows a very important historical battle. Again, in the year 333. A year later, they moved all the way into Egypt. They conquered Egypt. They secured Egypt, and and Alexander the Great assumed the title of Pharaoh in Egypt. And a year after that, in 331, they moved east into Persia. They captured Susa, which, remember, that was back. Cyrus's palace was in Susa. They captured Babylon and Persepolis, which was another really important city in Persia. And they continued on east into Pakistan and even into India. India was about as far east as they got, but in 323, and keep in mind, during all this, Alexander never went back to Greece. It was really an odd thing. But in 323, his exhausted military headed back to Babylon, the city of Babylon, and I believe that's where Alexander the Great died at the age of 33. So in 12 or 13 years, he conquered the known world all the way to India, and he never made it back to Greece. And we're going to read a little bit. This is not out of the Bible. This is from an ancient Jewish historian whose name was Josephus. And this is not, I would say, widely known, but it's not really debated either. So, again, this is not out of the Bible. This is out of the works of the history according to Josephus. So it says, Alexander, the king of Macedon, crossed the Hellespont, and ultimately that means he was crossing into Asia. He defeated Darius' satraps at the Battle of Granaeus and was advancing further into Asia. And Darius awaited him at Issus in Cilicia. And everyone in Asia thought that Darius would easily defeat the invaders. This included Sanballat, who promised Manasseh, and I realize I'm skipping into this, so you don't know who some of these people are, but these are people from the area of north of Jerusalem that were not really Jews, and they didn't like the Jews. That when Darius returned from his victory, he would fulfill his promises. But Darius was defeated in a great slaughter and fled back into Persia. Alexander marched into Syria, taking Damascus and Sidon. You hear of the cities of Tyre and Sidon in the New Testament. And then besieged Tyre. So again, both of these were cities that Alexander the Great took. From there he sent a letter to the high priest of the Jews, asking him for supplies and requesting that he transfer his allegiance and tribute from Darius, who was the king of he was the king of Persia, and this was, I think, actually Darius the Third. But anyway, that he transfer his allegiance and tribute from Darius and Persia to Alexander. The high priest answered that he had promised Darius not to bear arms against him, and that he would keep his oath as long as Darius lived. Alexander, as a result, was very angry, and threatened that as soon as he had taken Tyre, he would march against the Jewish high priest. His example would teach all men that they must keep their oaths. So, meanwhile, Alexander had conquered Tyre, and following a 7-month siege, after 2 more months, he had taken the city of Gaza also, and then he hurried to go up to Jerusalem. So when Jaddua, the high priest, heard that Alexander was coming, he was terrified, and he ordered his people to join him in sacrifice and prayer to God. And appearing to him in a dream, God told him to take courage and decorate the city with wreaths. The people were to clothe themselves in white, and the priests with the robes of their order. Then they were to march out of the gates to meet the Macedonians, for they would not be harmed. So Jaddua awoke rejoicing, and announced the revelation to all. When he learned that Alexander was not far from the city, he went out in procession with the priests and the people. Alexander saw the procession coming towards him, the priests clothed in linen, and the high priest in a robe of blue and gold. On his head was a mitre with the golden plate on which God's name was inscribed. And approaching alone, Alexander prostrated himself before the name and greeted the high priest. That means Alexander bowed down to the high priest because of God's name. As the Jews welcomed Alexander with one voice and encircled him, his officers wondered if he had suddenly become insane. One of them, Parmenio, went up to Alexander and asked him to explain. Alexander replied, "When I was at Dium in Macedonia, considering how I could become master of Asia, I saw this very person in my sleep, dressed as he is now, and he urged me not to delay, but to cross over confidently and to take dominion over the Persians." Alexander was escorted into Jerusalem by the high priest and his attendants. He went up into the temple where he sacrificed to God according to the high priest's directions. And when the book of Daniel was shown to him, which predicted that one of the Greeks would destroy the Persian Empire, he thought himself to be the one so designated. When he offered the Jews whatever they desired, the high priest asked that they might observe their own laws and be exempt from the tribute every 7th year. Alexander granted these requests, and they further asked that the Jews in Babylon and Media be allowed their own laws, and he also agreed to that. Finally, he told the people that if any of them wanted to enlist in his army, he would allow them to continue their own customs, and many joined his army. That was a custom that Alexander the Great did. When he defeated people, he would ask people, warriors, to join his army as he went further east and south, and a lot of them did. So according to Josephus, who was responsible for starting Alexander's conquering mission? This is something that I'm sure you won't learn in any history class, but according to this, Alexander said that it was the God of the Jews who started this and told him to cross. He didn't know who it was at the time. He just followed the dream. But when he saw the high priest, he realized who the God of the Jews must be. And it's a pretty amazing story. Alexander the Great was quite a warrior and conqueror and leader. And although he didn't live very long, the things that he accomplished and the areas that he conquered really set the stage for sharing one culture and language across the known world at that time. And that was a major turning point in history. We're going to talk a little bit later about who succeeded him, because he didn't have any kids. He was not married. But this really was a turning point in history that, again, takes place between the Old Testament and the New Testament in the Bible. Okay, we're going to talk about the last slide for this week, slide 6. And it's talking about the time of Greek rule of the known world after Alexander the Great. So remember, Alexander the Great did not live to be king very long. It was only about 13 years. And he died with no sons. So the empire was actually split 3 ways after his death for 3 of his main generals. And in general, they're called the Seleucid, the Antigonid, and the Ptolemaic kingdoms. Those names didn't really mean a whole lot to me, but in general, one of the kingdoms was in Macedonia, which was actually Greece. One of them was kind of centered in Egypt, and one of them was more in Asia, more of the Babylon and area around that. So what we would call the Middle East. So, again, like I said a minute ago, Alexander's reign brought a uniting culture, and that was a huge deal. It also brought about a uniting language, and that changed this whole area from then on. But it did not bring political unity. And these 3 different Greek kind of kingdoms all were Greek, but they fought with each other for many, many years. And Jerusalem, because remember, God put the Jews in the area of Jerusalem because it was a crossroads between Egypt and Asia and Europe. But during this time, it was kind of unfortunate because they were right in the middle of a lot of the fighting. And that area, the area around Jerusalem was controlled by the Egypt portion of Greece and the Asian portion of Greece. I say Asian, we think of it as Middle East, at different times, and they went back and forth. And this went on for around 150 years. It was all Greek control, but a lot of fighting amongst them. In 168 BC, so if you think back, we said in the last slide that around 333 to 330 was the time of Alexander the Great, so this was quite a bit later. 168 BC, one of the kings named Antiochus IV implemented some really harsh restrictions. He was really a bad guy, and he really did not care for the Jews. He didn't care what they wanted to do. He didn't care how they worshiped God, and he didn't care about God. He kept them from a lot of the customs that the Jews had been able to practice for quite some time, and he was very hard on the people. He kept them from worshiping in the temple altogether. And we're going to read a little bit about Daniel's prophecy of this in Daniel chapter 11. So we're going to start in Daniel chapter 11, verse 27 through 32. So again, this was prophesied to Daniel years before this actually happened. Starting verse 27 of Daniel chapter 11. Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table, but it shall not prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time. While returning to this land with great riches, the king's heart shall be moved against the holy covenant. So he shall do damage and return to his own land. At the appointed time he shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter, for ships from Cyprus shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the holy covenant and do damage. This is kind of hard to understand. We're starting in the middle of this prophecy, but it's talking about fighting among two of the three Greek tribes or Greek areas. And when it's talking about the king shall be grieved and return in rage, it's talking about Antiochus IV. The ships from Cyprus are actually Romans, and Rome was starting to be able to control some of this area, and Rome had an impact on what was going on here. So we're picking up in verse 30. So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant, and forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. This is the temple. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices, and place there the abomination of desolation. Those who do wickedly against the covenant shall corrupt with flattery, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. So this is one of Daniel's prophecies that's hard to follow. But ultimately we know from history that this is talking about Antiochus IV and his actions. He did take away a lot of the things that the Jews had been doing, and he committed what Daniel called the abomination of desolation, which was a really evil act. And what this was, as you know from studying the Bible and listening to sermons about Jesus in the New Testament, the Jews had a very strict diet, and one of the things that they were not supposed to eat or even be anywhere near was pigs, which seems like a fairly normal thing for us, but to the Jews it was not. And the Jews considered pigs unclean. And it was because that came from God's laws all the way back from Moses. So, back to Antiochus IV. After he kicked the Jews out of the temple and wouldn't let them go in, he built an altar to the Greek god Zeus in the temple, and he sacrificed a pig on it. And that was a really, really big deal. That was the abomination of desolation. And that really set off a group of Jews who decided they couldn't possibly allow this to happen anymore. They were obviously led by God, and they were blessed. And it was started by a family of priests And one of the sons who kind of was the leader, his name was Judas Maccabeus. Ultimately, they revolted and rebelled against Antiochus, and they actually won. They regained control of the temple. And in the act of regaining control, they started setting up some of the Jewish sacrifices, which included lighting the menorah, the big candle that was in the temple. And although they didn't have enough oil, the oil lasted for several days. And Jews now celebrate the festival of Hanukkah, which I'm sure you've heard of. And that was about this time in history. Hanukkah is celebrated because, and it's around Christmas time, but it doesn't have anything to do with Jesus. It has to do with this period of real history where the Jews regained control of the temple because God allowed it to happen. And they defeated the Greek military that had been there in Jerusalem. So this was known as the time of the Maccabees, and it was because of the name of one of the sons who started this revolt. And basically from this point in time, so this was in 168 BC, until the time that Rome came in to start control, the Jews actually had control again, and they weren't really forced to do anything by any other world powers. The next obvious world power that we're going to talk about at the next lesson is Rome. And that really sets the stage for the New Testament and the time of Jesus that we're more familiar with. But that really concludes this lesson of Persian and Greek control of the area. It's a pretty neat time in history, and there's a lot of history here, and probably these are some of the more popular historical time frames that you'll talk about in school. So hopefully it goes along with what you've learned, but I appreciate you guys sitting through this, and we'll try it again next week or coming up soon. Anyway, thank you for sitting through it. We'll see you later.